Welcome to Liberty, Leadership, and Lies, the podcast where we unravel the complex web of politics, power, and deception. Each week, we dive into the stories behind the headlines, exploring how liberty is eroded and the selfishness of our political leaders, as well as the lies that shape our world. Join us as we dissect the truth from fiction by examining the tactics used by the new aristocracy, the political class, at the local, state, and national levels of government as we dare to challenge the status quo. Get ready for thought-provoking discussions, exclusive interviews, and a journey into the heart of what really drives our society. Liberty, Leadership, and Lies, where your understanding of the world begins to change. Tune in every Monday morning and prepare to see beyond the veil.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Yep, I'm back for my second Footsteps of Paul pilgrimage with my church. Let me tell you, though, the second go-around was not better than the first, and it all has to do with the travel agency, Nawas International. That's a story for next week's or a later show, though. Now, let's talk about this week's episode. Once again, folks, good morning, patriots, truth seekers, and anyone who's ever felt the slow squeeze of a worldview that no longer fits. Welcome to this week's show, where we've cut through the fog of political spin, exposed the rotten leadership, and reclaimed the principles that made America and Tennessee exceptional. Today is November 10th, 2025, exactly 250 years since the United States Marine Corps was born in Tun Tavern, Philadelphia. Semper Fi to every devil dog listening, and most especially those that I continue working alongside during my post-service career. Also, tomorrow is November 11th. That's Veterans Day. This one, as well as Memorial Day, hits me in the heart every year. I think of that 19-year-old kid on the USS Missouri who never made it home from the war. The Marine who lost both legs outside Fallujah but still salutes when the flag goes by. The quiet Vietnam vet in my church who shakes my hand every Sunday and says, "Thank you for your service," like he didn't carry the heavier load. If you see a veteran tomorrow, whether they're in a wheelchair at the VA, bagging your groceries, or just walking their dog, stop, look them in the eye, say thank you for standing the watch so I could sleep safe. And if you're able, buy their coffee, pick up their tab, or just listen to their story. They earned every second of it. On this Marine Corps birthday and the eve of Veterans Day, we're talking about another kind of battle. The fight for your mind, your conscience, and your soul inside the progressive machine. Our guest today is Lisa Ekman, former Democrat lobbyist, 20 plus years inside the Washington Beast, and now the author of a book that's rattling cages from Capitol Hill to the faculty lounges. The title alone should stop you in your tracks. Deprogramming Democrats and Uneducating the Elites, How I Escaped the Progressive Cult. Yeah, you heard that right, folks. Cult. Let me paint the picture of who Lisa was before the Great Escape. For 20 years, Lisa Ekman worked in Washington, D.C. as a Democratic advocate and lobbyist, supporting and advancing the party's policy goals. It was not until the COVID-19 pandemic hit when her eyes were suddenly opened to her cult-like devotion to a party that was, in all actuality, leading Americans down the slippery slope of tyranny. The truths she uncovered are now revealed through deprogramming Democrats and uneducating the elites in the hopes of helping others who have had similar awakenings and to help wake up others. The truths include her own dedication to the progressive cult she had been programmed to become a part of, and how the progressive cult evolved, the tools used to educate that evolution, why those tools worked, and how to undo the programming that has led us to where we are. Lisa has a law degree from Georgetown University, a master's in social work from the University of Denver, and a bachelor's in communication and rhetoric from Northwestern University. During her 2 decades working in D.C., she worked for Democratic senators, a federal agency, government contractors, and nonprofit organizations. She moved to Virginia in 2020 when she woke up and deprogrammed herself. She lives with her fiance, their 5 dogs, and chickens on her farm where they grow organic fruits and vegetables. Her awakening began when she started asking questions the script didn't allow. She read primary sources instead of talking points. She watched the same leaders who preached follow the science ignore data when it threatened their funding streams. In the book, Lisa names names with receipts, exposes the psychological compliance techniques used in progressive training seminars, and most importantly, charts a path back to independent thought grounded in first principles. But here's what separates this from every other political tell all. Lisa doesn't just torch the left and walk away smug. She wrestles with her own complicity. She quotes scripture alongside declassified memos and issues of challenges to conservatives too. Because groupthink isn't a partisan problem, it's a human one. In the next hour, we're going to walk through her journey, how the Democrat Party became a secular religion with its own sacraments, excommunications, and indulgences. The moment she realized social justice had morphed into a grift that enriched consultants while impoverishing the very communities it claimed to save. The practical tools she gives readers, checklists, conversation scripts, even a 30-day media fast to break the spell. And the cost? Well, lost friendships, death threats, doxing, the whole cancel culture package. We'll also talk leadership because real leaders don't demand conformity, they cultivate courage. And we'll close, as we always do, at the foot of the cross because no political realignment lasts unless it's built on the only foundation that never shifts. So whether you're a lifelong conservative who's never understood how smart people buy the progressive Kool-Aid, or a disillusioned Democrat who's starting to smell the rot, or a parent watching your kid come home from college spouting slogans that sound like cult chants, strap in. Lisa's about to hand you the red pill, the playbook, and the parachute all in one. So grab your coffee, turn up the volume, and let's get into it. Liberty, leadership, and lies, because the truth will set you free.
Hey there, truth seekers. I'm Larry Litton, your guide through the maze of modern politics and power dynamics on liberty, leadership, and lies. Each episode will challenge the narratives, expose the lies, and celebrate the leaders who champion true liberty. Get ready to question, learn, and maybe even change your mind. So let's dive into the truth together.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Lisa's joining us here on this week's podcast. And Lisa, thanks so much for joining us today.
It is my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Now, before we jump into the book, which is really the heart of our conversation today, why don't you give our listeners a quick snapshot of your background? You spent over 20 years as a Democratic advocate and a lobbyist in Washington. What drew you into that world initially?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I was in my mid-20s. I went to social work school and to get my master's, and I thought I wanted to work as a direct practitioner in social work. But what I found out while I was in school was that I didn't really have the emotional constitution to do that. I work with some pretty hard populations to work with, and I couldn't keep my own emotional well-being. I was either crying all the time or completely a stone, and neither of those two extremes are very good for your own mental health. And so I decided I wanted to do something that would make the jobs of the social workers easier and would help improve our country. And I was the president of my graduate student association at the University of Denver, and both for the whole graduate population as well as the social work school. And the advisor in the social work school said, "Hey, would you move for a good job?" And I said, "Well, it depends on how good the job is and where it is." And she said, "Well, there's this program called the Presidential Management Internship Program, and it's designed to draw people with graduate level education into federal service. And you have to be nominated by the dean of your school, and we'd like to nominate you if you'd be interested in doing that." And so, I was pretty skeptical of the government at the time, but I said, if there aren't good people on the inside trying to make it better, how's it going to get any better? And maybe I could really make a difference in the lives of social workers. So I did end up taking that job and went into that program, and I got hired to work at the Social Security Administration, trying to help people with disabilities who are receiving benefits go back to work. And I was working directly for a appointee of Bill Clinton in the Clinton administration at the very tail end of it in 1999. And then I was sent from that agency to work in the Senate for a number of different senators, including someone probably everyone has heard of, Ted Kennedy, and also Tom Harkin, who most people probably have heard of, sort of the liberal lions in the Senate of their day. And the more I was there, the more I started to believe in government, the more I started to believe in the mission of the government, and really started to become a real bleed blue, vote blue, no matter who Democrat. When George W. Bush was elected for his second term, I decided I would take a break and go to law school, which is kind of a joke. Obviously, law school is not a break, but it seemed like it might be hard for me to do my job in that environment. So I went to law school, and during that time, I was the president of the Law Democrats, and I worked on President Obama's first campaign, and as a volunteer doing disability outreach, and really just, was working to improve federal programs for people with disabilities. But as you can see, I was very in the Democratic machine. My parents were very liberal people who were liberals, though, in the JFK sort of model of liberals, meaning that I really always have believe very deeply in our Constitution, our individual liberties, and the beauty of the American experiment and its unique place in the world. In fact, in the history of the world, that we've never had a civilization that takes our natural-born, God-given rights and enshrines them in their governing document the way that ours does with the First and the Second Amendments and so on. And so, being in the environment I sort of lost sight of that in some ways. And that I think, but that always was the basis of my belief, was that we're not free unless we're individually free. So, that sort of gives you sort of a background of, who I was, how deep in the blue I was, and as we'll get into, how indoctrinated and programmed and brainwashed I was. So.
Wonderful. Well, that's a powerful starting point, and I guess it sets the stage perfectly for your book. So let's talk about it. It's called Deprogramming Democrats and Uneducating the Elites. So what inspired you to write it? Was there a specific moment or event that made you say, I need to share this story?
I need to go. So, my awakening, as I like to call it, some people might call it my red pill moment. But my awakening to the truth and reality happened during COVID. And I think that's a common story that you might hear these days, Larry. But I do need to go back just a little bit in time to kind of set the stage for how that happened. And, there's a sad story that I have, that I lost both of my parents between 2014 and 2016. My dad died in 2014, my mom in 2016, to illness. And, my mom was taking care of my dad when he was very ill. And she was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And it was one of those, you should get your affairs in order because we don't know that you have very much time, speeches that the doctor gave her. And she came to me, and I did disability policy work, I did employment, but I also did healthcare, and I worked really closely with the healthcare agencies in DC. And my mom said, Lisa, I'm going to do conventional medical treatment, but I also am willing to try other things, to give me a better shot. I mean, the survival rate for 5 years with her cancer was in the single digits. So it was very, very aggressive. So I said, okay, I'll do the research. First thing I said is don't go do any yourself because it's not going to help you feel better about your chances. I'll do it all for you. And that's what I did. That was my job. So I started looking at all this stuff, and I found a lot of information with really good science to it, that really talked about how what you eat and what you put on your body and the environmental toxins you expose yourself to, and how you address your trauma and your spiritual health, has a huge impact on how you your survival. So we brought my mom to a naturopath in addition to her oncologist, and we changed her diet. We changed everything she put in and on her body and cleaned her house with and worked with visualization and meditation. My parents were not practicing in any religion, but we did a lot of positive affirmations and those kind of things to try to address the spiritual piece and her belief that she was going to survive. Well, she had surgery, and then she started a round of 6 treatments of chemo. And they did some tests after the third chemo treatment, and she was cancer free. And a couple of months after the diagnosis, at the point which they told her, we're not sure you're still going to be alive at this point, and she was totally cancer free. Her doctor was surprised. It's a miracle. I've never seen this happen with this. And she was cancer free for 2 years, completely cancer free. Her tests all they don't in the case of her cancer, they don't call it remission. They because it could come back at any time, and they just call you cancer free because your markers are in the normal range and you don't have any visible growths. And then after 2 years, a tiny little growth appeared on one of her scans, and she started chemo again at the advice of her doctor, and the chemo fried her kidneys, and she died very shortly after that, after 2 years with no problems. And so, what that did, Larry, was it really kind of shook my faith in all of these agencies, because part of it is that there is a lot known, and there's been a lot known about what you can do to help support yourself through cancer treatment. A lot of it has to do with nutrition, as I said, and toxic exposures. And at one point, her doctor said to me, "Oh, it doesn't matter what she eats. She should just eat whatever feels good." Well, cancer feeds on sugar. So that's some of the worst advice you could ever give a cancer patient. So it started shaking all of these, the faith that I had placed in these agencies, the faith that I had placed in my government. What is the USDA doing, giving us certain nutrition advice that doesn't make any sense? And what is the FDA doing, and the CDC, and all of these things? So this started to create some cracks in the dam that held the flood of truth back from me. But I had to go back to work after that, and I went back to work working with those very agencies, and I had to have like sort of pigeonhole that in the back of my mind so that I could go work with people that in the back of my mind I wasn't sure were actually doing things for the best interest of the people of this country. And so fast forward to COVID, and we're I had also been started to become really disillusioned with Washington. I will say that over the 20 years I was there, it really changed, Larry. I mean, not that they were ever doing what was in the 100% best interest of us as we the people, but there used to be the ability to have what I would call good faith conversations, looking for compromise that may actually benefit people, but you might not get exactly what you want. But by the time we get to COVID, I had lost all of that faith in the system. All I saw was politics. All I saw was people fighting for money, fighting for power. And, how many meetings was I in where someone said, well, that might be a great policy idea, but I don't like the optics of it for the next election, and we're going to have to go against it. And to me, that's not what our government should have been doing. I have much stronger views about that now, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But I had actually decided to retire March 31st of 2020, which, if you can remember back to then, we were just coming out of the 2 weeks to flatten the curve right around then. We were in lockdowns, we were having all of that happen. And I'm kind of ashamed to say now, when COVID first hit, I bought all of the fear porn. I bought all of the paranoia. I didn't want to kill grandma. I didn't want to hurt anybody. So I was really afraid. And my partner, Jamie, who was my boyfriend at the time, he was not. He was not buying it. He didn't understand, where all of this was really coming from. And so, as you might imagine, we were having some rather heated discussions about this every day. But at the same time, some of the advice they were giving didn't make any sense to me based on what the research I did for my mom, and this is why I tell that story, is because she So, for example, I use this example because it's really easy to understand. There's no debates about the science on this one at all. One of the very first things they said, and you may remember this, but a lot of people black out a lot of what happened during COVID, it seems. But we were told we couldn't leave our house unless we were an essential worker. And even if you had a yard, you weren't supposed to go out in your own yard. You were supposed to stay in the house. Well, vitamin D, everybody agrees. And if you want to go to the NIH website, there's tons of studies that show this. One of the most important things about for your health, to keep you healthy, for your immune system. And now there's lots of stuff about how most of the people who had any issues with COVID were vitamin D deficient. Well, the very first thing you shouldn't do is tell people not to go out and get sun. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So all of that stuff I had kind of pigeonholed in the back of my mind was sort of gnawing at it, trying to get out. And of course, the one that is really silly is the 6 foot social distancing, which they've now admitted there was no science to. And I started to look for the science and it wasn't there. Okay. So there's all of that on the one hand. On the other hand, they're starting to censor people. They're starting to censor people I know are talking truth, that are natural health practitioners I followed. There were the people, the doctors, the tens of thousands of doctors and scientists and researchers who had signed the Great Barrington Declaration that said we should really be focusing on the most vulnerable. Everybody else should be able to go along with their lives. And there was no discussion of it. There was no public debate. There was no data. There was no evidence. It was just, we told you to do this, so you're going to do it, and we're going to shut down any dissent, and we're going to bury debate. Now, in the meantime, all these people who I will admit that I kind of villainized everybody on the right before, that I thought really didn't know what they were talking about, were like, do your own research, prove me wrong, show me the receipts, prove me wrong. And it was all causing a lot of chaos in my brain. So one day, Jamie and I were having a discussion, and he said, I said, Jamie, I just can't believe it. I can't believe that these people that I've worked with over the past, almost 20 years would do this to us, would do this to the world without data and evidence to support what they're doing. And Jamie looked at me dead in the eyes and he said, Lisa, if they'll poison our water, what won't they do? And my brain stopped because one of the things I've found about people on the left, including myself in the past, is that they can hold a great deal of cognitive dissonance. When you hear them say, well, things that just don't seem to be able to go together, like, for example, and this is skipping ahead a little, but yeah, we're the defenders of democracy, but we're going to put a candidate forward who didn't get a single vote, but we're the ones who care about democracy. They seem to be able to hold those two ideas together fine. And so I could do that too, but my brain couldn't think a way out of that contradiction. If they really are caring about our health, if they really want us to be healthy, why are they putting fluoride in our water? Why are they putting chlorine in our water? Why are they, not doing something to make sure that you don't get the remnants of your neighbor's prescription drugs in your water when water is the most essential thing? So that happened. And the censorship happening was big for me because I am a First Amendment absolutist. And the First Amendment isn't about letting people speak in the best of times, Larry. It's about letting people speak in the worst of times when people in power are trying to subvert our rights. And it requires you to let someone you think who is spouting lies spout those lies. And in the public square, you get to debate them. And if you have the truth, truth will win. Well, my party that I had been a part of, that I became so tribal about, was the one doing the censorship. And so, Jamie and I were having this debate, and Jamie said, prove me wrong. And I said, okay, I will. And then I actually started doing real research. And then that's when my brain really broke. My reality dissolved. I realized that I was living a lie and in a lie that was created through brainwashing, programming, and indoctrination. And it was one of the hardest things, probably the hardest thing I've ever been through, because all of my self-esteem, my confidence, my self-image was wrapped up in my identity as a Democrat. Because I wasn't just your average Democratic voter. It was my life. It was how I made my money. It was who I surrounded myself with. It was often what I did outside of work was go to help canvass and do things politically. So that is how I had my red pill experience. And there was a moment, it was that question, but it was also all those other things leading up to it as well.
Oh, interesting story. So we're going to take a quick break right here. When we come back, we're going to get more into the story. We're talking with Lisa Ekman. She's the author of Deprogramming Democrats and Uneducating the Elite. So stick with us. We'll be right back. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back with Lisa Ekman, and we're talking about her book, Deprogramming Democrats and Uneducating the Elites. So, Lisa, in your book, you describe your journey as escaping a progressive cult. That's pretty strong language. Can you unpack what you mean by that? How does the progressive movement operate like a cult in your experience?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. And a lot of people there will say to me, well, who's the charismatic cult leader? And well, there isn't one charismatic cult leader. What it is that they worship authority and they idolize the expert. And so if someone in authority tells them something, they believe it. And if that person is an expert, it's like a false idol. And you can just look at Anthony Fauci from how he was treated during COVID when practically everything that came out of his mouth was untrue. But he was the science, so we weren't able to question him about these things. And so, how does it operate as a cult? Well, you are only allowed to have certain beliefs when you're in the progressive cult. And if you vary from those beliefs, you're immediately excommunicated. You are encouraged to cut off family members who think differently than you. They try to restrict you from hearing information that contradicts what they believe in. Most of the people on the left, at least the hardcore lefties, they don't have a relationship with God or the creator. So they put that faith somewhere else and they put that faith in government. And so it's not a cult like, any of these religious cults where people end up, drinking the Kool-Aid in that way, but it is a cult like devotion to authority. And, they believe that more government is always better, more, and they want to increase the power to the people who are already in power to have more control over our lives. And they really do require some ideological conformity to stay an active member in good standing of the party. And I'll use this example. I think if you think back to what the left used to say about abortion, they wanted it to be safe, legal, and rare. And now it is, if you don't support abortion up to the day of delivery, then you are a bad person who doesn't believe women have any reproductive rights. And so if you that's sort of how the ideology in the cult evolved, and they will, um, I saw some women, testifying before Congress ask the question, should a person be able to have an abortion up to the time? And they said person because obviously that's a whole other thing, but I would say, should a woman be able to have an abortion up to the time, of delivery? And their only answer to that was, I believe this is a decision between the woman and her healthcare provider. And so if you didn't have that answer, you can't be part of the group, and you will be, and we have seen them cancel people, deplatform people, excommunicate people, dox people, all of those things. And these are cult-like behaviors. I mean, it's, I think for me, it's because their belief in experts and their belief in government have risen to the level of a sort of religious faith. And so that is why I call it a cult. And it is about deprogramming yourself. And the biggest thing is that you are not encouraged to think for yourself. If you ask too many questions, you're bad, and that is very, again, cult-like behavior. Don't question the dear leader because dear leader um, knows everything, and experts who are sort of, to use sort of religious terms, are disciples of dear leader, and then so you don't question the disciples either. So
You know, call them the branch Covidians, like,
yeah,
and
exactly.
that is definitely a trademark of a cult. The ideological purity keeps getting whittled down to just to the smallest thing, and then you vary from that, and you are going to be drinking the Kool-Aid in the other sense of the term.
Yeah, no, 100%. And that, I think, the need for ideological conformity, the fact that, and you have these different branches. So you have the gender ideology cult within the progressive cult. And, the idea that you cut your family off if they don't support you. And that is the biggest thing, isolating you from your natural support network if they don't believe exactly like you do is one of the hallmarks of a cult's behavior. And you can see that. And you can see that too. The other issue that, I never really quite was with my party on was the immigration issue. And now, I mean, I'm not sure half of the people believe we even should have borders, at this point, let alone having an understanding that to have a functioning society, we have to have some beliefs in common, some basic principles that we all believe in. And when you just open your borders like we have, it's very hard to maintain that in order to have a cohesive, high trust society. So.
Right. They believe the complete opposite of the rest of the world, that borders are necessary to maintain the integrity of a nation. You need three things: borders, language, and culture. And open borders just completely gets rid of that.
And if your goal is to destroy the country for a variety of reasons, maybe towards to get a more communist-like government, then that makes an awful lot of sense, I think. But if your goal is to protect this very unique republic that we have, there's no way you can make sense out of that.
Absolutely. Now, on the next question, one of the key themes in your book seems to be this idea of deprogramming Democrats. For listeners who might be questioning their own political alignments, what are some of the first steps you outline in the book for starting that deprogramming process?
So I'll start with how you deprogram yourself, and then give a little bit about how you might help someone who you think might be open or ready to hear some truth. The biggest thing that happens, and I think the first thing I would say is that stop relying on other people's opinion for your own self-esteem. And this is a big way that the progressive cult keeps people in line. People on the left tend to, and I think again, this comes back to a lack of relationship with the creator because, when you have a relationship with God, He's got your back. You know that you're accepted. You know that you're good and you're okay. When you don't, you need that from somewhere. And a lot of people don't get that from family. And often it's hard in today's day and age to get that from community if you don't have a church you belong to or you're not involved in community groups. So a lot of people are looking for that. And part of that is your own self-worth then comes from the external validation of people in this group. And the first thing I would say is believe in yourself. Believe that you have the ability to understand things and make sense of things without an expert and someone else telling you what is true and what is not. And then the second thing is that once you can do that, then start asking questions. Because one of the things we saw during COVID and we've seen throughout the whole, I think, uh, post-COVID era is that asking questions is a no-no, and this starts from the indoctrination in school because, and the more you're in school, the more this happens. Like you can ask the teacher questions, but if you really question teacher, you get in trouble. When you question authority, you get in trouble, and that's you don't want to get in trouble. You want to be a good kid, so you stop asking questions. And when you question the ideological orthodoxy of the progressive cult, that's when they start calling you names that usually end in phobia or ism or those kind of things. And that's when they start to threaten to dox you or kick you out of the club. And so let yourself ask questions again. And that is a big, big part of it. Then I would say, talk to people who aren't like you. I think one of the things that's really hard sometimes is that, there's this superiority this on the left. There's this elitism of, especially for people who are highly educated, and looking down on people who aren't part of them. And you'll see this all the time on social media. I try not to spend too much time on social media, but like everyone, it's hard these days for me. But if you try to have a conversation with someone on the left and you want to use a source that they don't think is an expert, immediately, well, they just discount it. They don't even look at it. They won't even listen to it. And then they'll go to their favorite fact checker, who is also probably funded completely by money on the left. And we'll just debunk it. Oh, that's debunked. I don't need to listen to you. It's been debunked. So let yourself ask questions, then let yourself expose yourself to different sources of information. Have a conversation with someone who you disagree with. And not from a starting point of this person is bad, but because that's often where it is. Well, there is like this automatic assumption that someone on the right is bad, morally inferior to you. And don't do that. As a matter of fact, I can't say enough about how welcomed I've been and how wonderful people are, and actually full of love instead of hate on the right. And I'm not so sure I could say the same thing for everybody who comes from the right who might want to go to the left, that they would receive that same kind um, of reception. So those are a few things, and then I think the other thing is that um, I would say start following the money. Start taking a look at, actually, when we spend this money, where does it go? Who benefits? Who paid for it? So, for example, you look at all these organic protests that the left has. Well, a lot of times the people aren't even from the place that the protest is happening. Well, how did they get there? Who paid for that? And, start, asking yourself who paid for it, who benefited from it, and where does the money go? And I think oftentimes you get a really, really different story than you thought was true when you start following the money. And lastly, I think one of the other things about waking up that can be really helpful to deprogram yourself is actually really look into the history of the mainstream media. Look into the history of of Operation Mockingbird and how did that develop? And what is the relationship between our intelligence agencies and our mainstream legacy media? Because propaganda and censorship through these mainstream channels is a big way that people have been programmed. And when I say media, we went from 50 different companies in this country that owned media corporations, and we're down to five now. And when I say media, I don't just mean your nightly news. I mean your television programming, your movies, your music, your video games, your books. Everything is controlled by five people. And ask yourself, do I think they're actually telling me the truth? And then push yourself to ask more questions. And the biggest part of it, I think, Larry, is saying it's okay to ask questions and it's okay to think differently than other people. And it's okay to have an independent mind. Part of it is scary. And again, because you're reclaiming your own agency and now you are responsible for everything about yourself. And again, um, I would also say explore your faith. Explore. It's not going to work the same for everyone. And everyone, in my opinion, is going to have a different way that they connect to the creator. And that's okay. But it also is the way that we can know that we're all children of the creator, we're all connected, and it's a lot harder to hate someone when you have love in your heart. And you know how and I should say too, like fear is one using fear like they did during COVID is one of the most oldest time tested methods of control. You make someone afraid enough, they will practically do anything if you promise them you'll keep them safe. And again, when you have your faith, when you are connected to the creator, that is much harder to do. How many times in the Bible, for example, and it's not just the Bible, but does it say, be not afraid, do not fear, all of these things. So explore your faith, ask questions, talk to people who you disagree with an open mind and an open heart, and follow the money. So those are my suggestions for how you start to deprogram yourself. The idea really is about thinking for yourself and questioning the narratives that get fed to you over and over and over again, and reclaiming your own agency. It's a little bit harder to wake someone else up and help deprogram someone. If you want me to talk a little bit about that, I think the listeners might appreciate that.
Right, right. So a couple interesting points. You talked about how the left feels about those on the right, and something that I've heard years ago and is true no matter what side of the political fighting you see today is that those on the left, or no, let's start with those people on the right think Democrats and liberals are just people with bad ideas. The liberals think those on the right think the people on the right are bad people with ideas. So, and then the hardest part about the deprogramming, I think that you touched on here is the asking questions. We've got generations now taught by a government education system that have taught children not to ask those critical questions. I mean, they show up when a bell sounds, they dismiss when a bell sounds, they're taught not to question the authority figure in the front of the room. So getting people to start asking those questions, that's going to be the hardest part about this, because we've got a couple of generations now that cannot engage in critical thinking because of government controlled education.
I 100% agree with you. I have two chapters in my book about what I call the tools of control, and the education system is the first one, and propaganda and censorship is the second one. And so here's my advice on a basic technique, and I think you saw Charlie Kirk use this as well, and it is about asking questions. My technique, and I think it's more probably suited for females too than his was. His may have been a little bit, how do I say, aggressive for the females, and he did a fantastic job. I mean, you can see the difference in the votes of Gen Z in the last election, but it was almost all men who flipped to Republican. But asking questions is the way to go about it. You can't try to tell someone who's brainwashed anything. And here's the harder part, though. The questions can't presume an answer and can't include facts in them, okay? Because as soon as you say if it didn't come from an expert, they're going to dismiss them. But what asking questions does, it does a few things. First of all, it validates them. You're asking for their opinion. It shows, it gets at what you were just saying, that these are bad people. Well, this is a person who's actually interested in me and what I think and how I think. So maybe I'm not going to automatically flip into Republican bad. It also gives you the opportunity to actually really understand what they care about by asking these questions. And the other thing is that, I think, yes, the people on the right think the people on the left have bad ideas, but they also, not all of them, but a lot of them think they're stupid because of that. Okay. And I don't think that's true. I think they're all programmed and indoctrinated and brainwashed, which makes them appear stupid or makes them appear not to be using their brain. But it's important if you're trying to wake someone up to remember that there is a brain in there. It's just so subdued because of the programming and indoctrination. Most people on the left actually also are really compassionate people, and you couldn't tell that by how they behave online or what they say these days. But that is also a function of the brainwashing and the indoctrination. And so, what has happened is they take that compassion and they manipulate it using fear. And I'm going to use the gender ideology as an example in a second, and then a question you could ask that might get at that. And so that fear is used to manipulate that compassion and weaponize it into anger. And they're angry at you on the right because you don't care about that poor trans kid. Okay. So this, you can see where this comes from. And again, they think you're bad people because you don't care about this kid. They've also worked really hard to program them to have selective compassion. And that is that you can only be compassionate for people who are vulnerable, for people who are historically oppressed, for people. So you can't have any compassion for the white male who lives next door to you because he's had historical power, but for the person who he's had historical power over, you can. Okay. So this is what's going on in their mind. And part of what you're trying to do with these questions is get at their true compassion, get them back to thinking about. So we have this very small percentage, for example, of men or boys who think that they are women. Okay. So I have compassion for them too. My personal opinion is that they have a mental illness, and the compassion for them would be trying to help them understand why they feel that way so they don't feel that way anymore. But I have a lot of compassion for a young girl who might be forced to change in a changing room with one of these small, percentage of men who believe they're women. So the question you might ask is, I understand how it can be hard, right? Uh, to not believe you're in the right body. Um, but I also understand that it would be really uncomfortable for a young girl to be in the changing room with someone who has a penis. So uh, trans, why is that boys' feelings more important than the girls'? And so you see, I care about both of them. I really do. But what you're doing is not being compassionate for this girl. And I can tell you, like, I mean, when I came up, if it's so ridiculous that you would allow a boy, no matter what, into a girl's changing room. I mean, they would be arrested and prosecuted. Um, but because they say one certain thing, that changes. And that's the other thing, is to ask them, okay, so how do you solve this? Let's say let's say real trans women aren't a threat to young girls, but we all know that, these bad actors would take advantage of that. So where do you draw the line? What would they have to do to prove that they belong in the girls' locker room? And how do we keep that girl safe and, protect everybody's rights? So these are some of the ideas where you don't have to concede anything that you don't believe in, but what you're doing is trying to get them back to, you know, thinking and where is their true compassion? What do they, who should they care about? And you're also showing that you care about them. You also care, I care about everybody, every human. I want every human to be happy and thrive. I'm not willing to sacrifice the millions and millions of young women for a very small percentage of people who have what I consider a pretty significant mental illness. So,
Absolutely. And with that, we're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back with author Lisa Ekman. Stick with us, folks. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back with Lisa Ekman, the author of Deprogramming Democrats and Uneducating the Elites. And we left off with a couple of good topics there, especially showing compassion for those that don't typically show compassion all the way around. But Lisa, we're going to get into like one of the main themes of this podcast is leadership. And how has your view of true leadership evolved since leaving the Democrat Party? And does the book offer insights for aspiring leaders on avoiding the pitfalls of the groupthink that we've discussed all along with this cult thing?
so yeah, a true leadership to me is speaking your truth even when it's unpopular, speaking the truth when it might in the short term really negatively impact you because you stand on principle. And I think, excuse me, that's one of the things that became really evident to me after my awakening is that the people on the left in general have given up principle, the ends justify the means, um, and so, really standing on principle and being able to articulate those principles in a way that you're willing to have an open debate with everyone. And, it can be really, really challenging and frustrating to debate someone who is brainwashed. And again, I gave some suggestions on how you can approach these conversations, but that can be very, very frustrating. And I think that true leadership is about being afraid and doing it anyway, and when there is a lot of retribution around these days, there are a lot of doxing, and people swatting people and all sorts of things for when you stand up and say, no, I've had enough, and I think, but that's what courage and leadership is. It's saying right is right, and I'm going to stand up for it and speak about it. And um, you know, there may be consequences, but I would rather live on my feet than die on my knees, kind of thing, and that's really, I think, how I look at it differently. And, leadership is not about scoring points. Leadership is not about um, accumulating power for yourself. It's about setting goals and leading a team to get there. Um, only a weak leader would want everybody just saying yes. Only a weak leader would want groupthink. A weak leader, because with groupthink, no one's going to tell you about the fact that they think you're wrong and you're about to walk into, a pitfall and you're about to walk into a lot of problems. You want people to want to come to you and say, look, I hear what you're saying, but here's what I think X, Y, and Z. And maybe you still do what you were going to do, but a lot of times you might not. And so I think that, is a lot what I have learned about leadership. And there's a big difference between being a boss and a leader, and really being open to criticism and open to uh, real debate and conversation. And that's a big way that you avoid groupthink, I think, is encouraging the people on your team or the people that you're hoping will follow you to really question you, and being willing to admit that you're wrong if you are. And it is hard. I mean, the opening line of the prologue to my book, Larry, is admitting you're wrong is never easy. Admitting you're wrong about everything is next to impossible. And which is what I did, so.
Now, for those who had similar doubts, but they feel trapped by that social pressure or career ties, What advice from the book would you give them? Maybe walk us through one of the personal stories you share about breaking free.
Um, I think it is, I don't ever want to sugarcoat it, Larry. It is, as I said, it may have even been harder than losing my parents, going through this transition. You're gonna lose a lot of people, and I lost most of my friends. A lot of my friends were work related, so it's very hard. But and you will go through a what you call a dark night of your soul. You will have to go through some soul searching about how did I get here? How did this happen to me? And in my case, you may even go through, or in my case, I did, and people may even go through a period where they think they're going crazy because everything every foundation you had is turned upside down. Your reality crumbles. And so, I thought I was losing my mind, but you're not. You're reclaiming it. You lost your mind a long time ago, and the people around you, if they don't stay around you, aren't worth having around you, and that's the truth. Um, and it is very challenging at first to stand in your new space, to be who you are because in my case, I became someone that wasn't based on who I truly was inside. I became someone who I thought I had to be to succeed and fit in. And so it's really, really freeing when I, can come up and say what I truly believe. Um, and it's not that I don't care about people. I just don't care what they think about me if the truth hurts them. And so the advice I would give is really be open to meeting new people. Like I have lost a lot of friends, but I have so many new ones and so many people I can be myself with, and that I can have. I was just on a podcast or doing another show earlier today with someone who is in the center left. I can have these conversations and be respectful and not, and neither of us thought badly of each other because we spoke our truth and we were allowing each other to have different opinions without making a moral judgment just on the fact that they're different. Now, if someone, is walking around killing people, feel free to have a moral judgment about that person, but not just simply because they have views that are different than you. And so, um, I wouldn't want to sugarcoat it and say it's easy. I've met a lot of people who have woken up. I've talked to a lot of people throughout their process, and it's never easy. It's hard, but it's so worth it. Your mind is the one thing that you truly have. And if you have been indoctrinated and programmed, you don't actually have your mind. And getting it back is hard. It's depressing, and it requires a lot of work to rebuild it. But again, seek people out in person, talk to them face to face. I have a love-hate relationship with technology. I love it because you and I can sit here and have this conversation that we can share with, all of your audience and people that I know. And I wouldn't have woken up without it. I couldn't have woken up without being able to do research. Not on Google, by the way, everybody. Try a different one because the algorithms do actually hide things. But I wouldn't have been able to wake up. But I also think that it's so much easier to hate someone through a screen than it is to sit in front of them and, see their humanness. And so make sure you don't try to go through it without talking to people who might think similarly to you, go and not everyone you meet is going to be your cup of tea, just like not everyone on the same side that you used to be on was your cup of tea. But you're going to meet a lot of really wonderful people and you're going to make new friends. And then you get to decide who you are, who you want to be, and what your relationship with other humans and the creator is and everything else without the judgment of the cult on top of you. So
Now you mentioned having that conversation with some people that are left of center. You were on that show earlier today. I mean, I think this current administration has made that even more possible. Look at some of his prominent cabinet members. I mean, RFK is definitely not a righty, a conservative at all. He is definitely a left of center or a center left guy. Same thing with Tulsi Gabbard. I mean, I think they've experienced that same type of awakening that there are certain wings of the progressive party that are certainly cult-like, especially, I mean, Tulsi was even targeted by the government on her travel. And RFK is targeted by his own family members. It's crazy.
Yeah, it really is. And I think that's, what gives me a lot of hope is that I think there are a lot of people and, the reaction of many on the left to the tragic assassination of Charlie Kirk has woken a lot of other Democrats up. And I think there's a lot of people who understand that um, government is not the answer to all of our problems. In fact, they create a lot of our problems. And, that when you start looking at a government that is censoring people, trying to just have an open, honest conversation, and who question the orthodoxy of the party, you're very close to sliding down a slippery slope that it's very difficult to get back from. And yeah, I think the other thing I would encourage people to do is start looking for what you have in common with people instead of automatically looking for what divides you. Divide and conquer. I think that there's a very extremely powerful establishment in this country, left, right, center, all of it, whose main goal is to keep or grow the power and the money of that establishment, and that leaves out most of we the people. And we the people have a lot more in common with each other than we often see because um, we are constantly programmed to look for our differences. Left versus right, man versus woman, black versus white, um, you know, uh, and so religious versus not religious, all of the things that are being used to divide us. And divide and conquer is one of the oldest control strategies along with fear. And they go together. And so the more they can keep us looking at each other as the enemy, the less we can focus on reclaiming our power and restoring the vision our founders had for a very decentralized country where states have most of the authority and don't and most of that authority is not used in the way that it is used today to try to control all these aspects of our lives, and where we the people's individual rights are the most important thing. And I think that if we can get people to just if people just have conversations where they're looking for agreement as opposed to looking for what's wrong with the person that they're talking to, it can really really lead to some changes. And I think as you say, RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, and there are others, but I think it's very promising. And we're also seeing like Marjorie Taylor Greene and John Fetterman kind of reaching, out with the olive branch on some things. And who would have thought, right?
Who would have
Um,
thought John Fetterman would have been the voice of sanity in the Democrat Party?
exactly, exactly. But that shows you that, and he really is just asking questions about what his party's doing. That's what he's doing. And so I see some light there. I see that people are maybe starting to wake up and starting to ask more questions and being willing to be brave. He's gonna probably get primaried, and he
The
had to
knives are
decide.
out.
And he said, "I'm not leaving the Democratic Party," which he could. Others have left and become independents. Generally, a lot of them, I don't think, did it really because of good reasons, but that's a whole other topic. Could talk about for a while.
It's a whole nother book for you.
It could be. But the point being that, again, like I said, there may be consequences for speaking truth and asking questions. But if we don't do it, our republic really is at risk. And so I'm really glad to see it. I hope I continue to see it. And I hope we have more people in positions of power and leadership who are willing to say, enough is enough. We have to start asking questions, and we have to get rid of this tribalism. Our founding fathers warned us about political parties, and they warned us pretty hard. And in Federalist 10, they talked about the fact that factions could end our republic, and a well-running government could stop that. And in fact, they should. And I'd love to see more of our leaders talking that talk instead of pushing the division that is pushing our country to the brink of some really nasty stuff if we don't make a course correction. So
Absolutely. So as we wrap up, Lisa, if there's one takeaway from your book that you want the audience to remember, what would it be? And where can the listeners grab a copy of the book?
Well, I'll start with the last one first, and then end on the positive note. You can get my book at Amazon, and you can get it at Barnes and Noble. And if you want to find out more or get in touch with me, I have a website, deprogrammingdemocrats.com. So I think the one takeaway from my book is that our country is our country's in danger, and everybody needs to do their part to save her. And she's worth saving. And so, if you are currently under control, mind control of either party, of the establishment, do what you can to wake yourself up and free your mind and find your courage, because it is each and every one of our responsibilities in this republic to help keep it. And I encourage everyone to figure out how they can contribute to that mission.
Absolutely. Each one of us has a duty and a responsibility for citizenship in a republic. And chief among those is asking questions of those people that are supposed to be serving your interest in government. So, Lisa, fantastic talk with you today. Thank you again for sharing your courage and sharing your story. And folks, if you're ready to question the narrative and reclaim your mind, pick up Lisa's book today. It's a game changer. Lisa, thank you again for joining me today. I hope a lot of hits on the website soon and people start waking up and start reading your book.
Thank you so much, Larry. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I enjoy I'm really thankful that you have your podcast to spread the word about liberty and leadership.
Thank you very much. And you have a good night.
You too. Thanks.
Bye. As we wrap up this episode of the podcast, folks, I want to leave you with something that cuts deeper than politics, deeper than the lies of the elite or the chains of tradition. Let's close with some wisdom from God's word that never returns void. And it comes to us this week from the book of 1 Peter, chapter 1, verses 18 and 19. Knowing that you were not redeemed with corruptible things like silver and gold from your aimless conduct received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. Folks, I've spent 30 years in the Navy. I've saluted flags, worn medals, and defended traditions that felt unbreakable. I've seen men and women give their lives for causes that they believed were eternal. And I've watched Washington lobbyists, like our guest Lisa Ekman, trade in silver and gold, power, access, applause, thinking that was redemption. But Peter says, no, none of it lasts. Not your party loyalty, not your donor list, not your academic pedigree or your military record. All of it corrodes. That phrase, aimless conduct received by tradition from your fathers, it hits me in the chest every time. It's not just about the culture and customs in Peter's day. It's about any inheritance that tells you who you are, what you must believe, who you must hate to stay in the tribe. Democrat, Republican, veteran, professor, activist, if it's not rooted in the blood of the Lamb, it's aimless. It's a treadmill to nowhere. I've been there. I inherited a political faith once too. Thought the right leaders, the right laws, the right slogans would fix us. But I've seen the hypocrisy up close. I've watched compassionate elites crush dissent while preaching love. I've seen good sailors follow bad orders because tradition said so. And I felt the fear of stepping out of line, losing friends, losing rank, losing the script. But here's the freedom. You're not redeemed by performance. You're not bought by votes or virtue signals. You're redeemed by blood that never loses value. Jesus didn't die for a platform. He died for you, spotless, willing, final. So test every tradition against that standard. Ask, does this demand my soul? Does it silence my conscience? Does it make me hate my brother to prove I belong? If yes, then you must walk away. You've already been bought at a price no tradition can match. Lisa Ekman's book, Deprogramming Democrats and Uneducating the Elites, is a roadmap for that walk. But the destination isn't just political clarity, it's spiritual liberty. It's knowing the one who redeems you from every man-made gospel. So stand firm, friends. Read the Gospels. Let Christ redefine your inheritance and live free, truly free, because the Lamb has already paid the price. Thanks for leaning in today. Please subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen, and join me on X at my handles of @LarryForTN12 or @LiesLiberty. As always, you can also visit libertyleadershipandlies.com for more. And let's keep standing in the arena for liberty, leadership, and truth. God bless you. God bless Tennessee. And God bless these United States of America. Until next week, reveille, it's time to wake up.